Hello, I'm Stephen Minnis, and today I'm joined by Professor Annelise Riles. Annelise Riles is Professor of Far Eastern Legal Studies and a Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University. Professor Riles, welcome.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. It was in 2011, after the Fukushima disaster, in the weeks following that tragic event, you were based in Tokyo at the Bank of Japan.
Well, I actually had a research fellowship set up at the Bank of Japan right after that disaster, but I was there at a university during that time doing research.
And what was your research project there?
I was looking at various aspects of the regulation of the financial markets from an Asian perspective, because of course a lot of things that the G20 puts forward look a little bit different from Asia, so that's what I was doing.
Yes. And you've written quite movingly about how, in the aftermath of that tragedy, the people that you were sharing offices with in the Bank of Japan were reacting to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if anyone who has lived through a major earthquake, whether it's in Japan or in Chile or elsewhere, knows that life is never quite the same after those few minutes. And of course, it was a very, very difficult situation in Japan because it was a triple disaster. There was not just a terrible earthquake, but an enormous tsunami, the likes of which hadn't been seen in many hundreds of years, and not just a tsunami, but then a nuclear disaster. And it was something that I think caught many people, including myself, off guard. I mean, how could this happen? You know, living in Tokyo, it's a very cosmopolitan place, definitely a first world place, and you just never imagined that you could suddenly find yourself in a situation where there's no power, there's no water, you have to worry about physical safety in all kinds of different ways, and you also wonder, how did the political system fail us such that something like this could happen? How did the economic system fail us such that something like this could happen? Why didn't I think more about environmental issues before? And so I think for everyone that went through that, it was quite traumatic on different levels, on very physical levels of, how do I get through my day? How do I cope with the situation today? To the more existential, what is this all about? What does it mean? Will life ever come back to normal again?
And as part of that broader response by government, but also by the Bank of Japan and others, there was a big role for data in not just communicating to citizens in the aftermath of the event, but also in trying to find their way through it.
Right. Well, I don't think that was specifically connected to the earthquake. I mean, this question of how governments use data is something broader. I mean, it's part of all kinds of policy shifts taking place, and it certainly has been more important in the financial markets also. So I was interested in the fact that in finance, in financial regulation, we used to think we knew, how to regulate an economy. We used to think we had models that explained, whether it's interest rates are correlated with growth or what have you, and it seems that what goes on in the markets nowadays just defies all of those models. And so it's quite difficult for a regulator in that situation to know what to do, because of course we academics can throw up our hands and say, isn't it interesting that things defy the models, but when you're actually the person who's in charge and has to make decisions and worry about a big bang failure or what have you, it's quite frightening to think I have no idea anymore exactly what to do here, and yet I must do something. I'm in charge. And so what interested me was the way in which Japanese central bankers, but also other central bankers elsewhere, it's not just Japan, were turning to the huge troves of data that they collect through the normal process of clearing payments in the financial system to just try to figure out what was going on in real time, sort of saying, I may not be able to predict it, but maybe I can see right now what's going on. And that's a different model of what the state does, I think, what a planner does than used to be the case.
Because what we're seeing is the movement from a focus on sort of setting the markets on autopilot and letting the market regulate itself, to a more iterative, a more granular approach where they use data at various different points in the system to try and make interventions in a more hands-on way. Is that a product of the financial crisis, or is that something that's been building up for some time?
I think it is a product of the financial crisis to some extent, but I think the financial crisis was not just a financial crisis. It was also an epistemological crisis. It was a crisis of knowledge, of expertise. If you talk, I've spent 10 years studying financial regulation, and most of that was before 2008, but then quite a lot of it was after 2008 as well. And you see a quite dramatic change in the outlooks of the very same individuals over that period. I mean, not overnight, but through that process of dealing with that crisis. People came to lose their confidence a little bit. The question was, how could Lehman happen? How could something like this happen? And then the wind up of Lehman was so full of problems and so mismanaged that there was also a question: how come we can't do better in terms of this is surely not the last time this is going to happen, and yet we still don't have any clear ideas about what to do next. So I think there's a bit of an anxiety now among regulators that probably wasn't there to the same degree pre-2008.
And you've referred to the rise of data politics as a phenomenon. Within this, how important is collaborative research and collaborative policy making as a response?
So one of the things about all this data is, what do you do with it, right? You've got this mountains of data being poured into your systems. How do you make sense of it? And so part of the task then becomes to set up teams, private, public teams, and so on, to try to figure out how to solve these problems. And so there's obviously a lot of collaboration there. But you're referring to a paper that I've written in which I talk about the importance of collaboration more generally in a lot of fields, not just in finance, but as a kind of response to the sense that none of us really know the answers anymore. So I'm a financial regulator. I don't know what to do. What do I do? Maybe if I enter into partnership with a private party, they must know something, right? Private parties, likewise, are saying the same thing. It used to be that, one of my informants in a bank said to me, it used to be the person who was the best, smartest at trading got to be at the top of the heap. Now it's the person who has the best connections to policymakers and can schmooze the best with the state. Why? Because we don't have the confidence anymore. I mean, it's easier to make a deal with the government than it is to make money just outright in the markets anymore. And so it's all about collaborating with the state. So in lots of different spheres now, not just finance, but very much in financial regulation, you see everyone thinking that I don't know what to do anymore, but maybe if I work with somebody else, they must know. Let's work together. And so I'm interested in collaboration as it's emerging as a kind of new solution to all of our anxieties about the limits of our own expertise. Now, you could say, but that's great. Collaboration's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with collaboration, absolutely. I'm not suggesting it's necessarily a good or bad, but it's interesting that it's become the dominant genre, if you like, or way in which we go about regulating or about structuring state-market relationships. And it's just a new template that's very dominant that we just need to be aware of.
And one particularly interesting application of this template is the Meridian 180 project. This, if I understand your writing correctly, came out in some ways of the aftermath of 2011 and the Fukushima crisis. But within the East Asian context, there's a lot of what you could refer to as track 2 diplomacy and so forth. This is a very different project, isn't it?
Oh, yes. So after Fukushima, I was starting to have a lot of informal conversations with friends, policymakers, academics, people in the financial markets, others, and there was a lot of anxiety or sense of I need to have some conversations about the big picture here. I only see my bit of the elephant, but this is so important, and I don't know how to make sense of it.
Sure.
And there was also a sense that there was a particular piece that was missing, which was transnational conversation. That, when something like Fukushima happens, it has tremendous impact outside of Japan. The radiation goes to Korea or China, eventually comes to the U.S., across the Pacific. And also that Fukushima itself was a product. It wasn't just a Japanese phenomenon. I mean, of course, General Electric built that reactor. An American company was involved. The transnational community of regulators is very much a transnational. It's not just Japanese regulators. They're talking to people in the U.S. and the U.K. and elsewhere all the time. And so somehow there needed to be a conversation across national borders. But that's very hard to do because why? Well, you have very, very busy people who don't have time to engage in a lot of conversations with anyone, much less people way outside of their zone of normal interaction. You have language barriers. You have disciplinary barriers. People would say, I really wish I knew a philosopher because I feel like this is a philosophical question, but I'm a central banker. How would I ever have a conversation with a philosopher, right? Yes. So we thought, all right, well, maybe one job for the academy would be to facilitate that kind of conversation. Right? No other social institution could really do that. So maybe we could do it. And let's see if we could just eliminate some of those points of friction or some of those barriers and start to make that conversation possible. So we built a platform staffed by postdocs who translate all these conversations into 4 languages: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and English. We very, very carefully, we set up membership teams and very, very carefully selected groups of very, people who are at the top of their game in various fields, but also were quite wide thinking and interested in this kind of conversation. And we just started having private, under-the-radar conversations about really hot-button issues. And, some of them are about nuclear politics, some of them are about disputes, territorial disputes in East Asia. Some of them are about things like war memory, the impact of the questions of Japan's obligations to the China and Korea and other countries that it occupied during World War II. I mean, very difficult questions that need to be addressed, but that somehow have no space to be addressed. And as you say, though, it's very different from track 2 diplomacy as it's normally conceived, because and that is very important. Track 2 is very, very important.
Yes.
But it tends to be quite disciplinarily bound. So you usually have sort of international relations specialists from different countries talking to one another, or lawyers. Here, this is much more open-ended. We have people from many, many fields, and so it's not just diverse nationally or by linguistic group, but also by disciplines and fields. And so I think it's perhaps less clear what the outcome is, what the valuable output is in the short run. But on the other hand, I think the larger project is to build a kind of transnational community of very committed, brilliant, and well-situated people who could perhaps collectively come up with some answers to difficult questions, who have the willpower to do that, and who also have the resources to perhaps create national constituencies for those views once they get agreed upon among the group.
And just finally, looking at dialogue in Northeast Asia more generally, what would your observation be at this moment in time?
I think this is a very difficult and potentially dangerous time. And I don't think that we in the North Atlantic, either on this side of the Atlantic or on my side of the Atlantic, are paying enough attention to this. We think, things in East Asia, of course, there seem to be these little spats, but how serious can it be? Actually, we see the rise of quite nationalistic governments in all of Northeast Asia: China, Japan, and South Korea. See nothing of North Korea, of course. And those reflect, in turn, a lot of anxiety among national populations. The economy is not good, and even in China, there's a lot of anxiety about the growth rates being substantially down over past years and what implications of that. And a kind of inward lookingness. We used to see huge numbers of Japanese students studying overseas. And now there's not those numbers have dwindled, and part of it is finances, but part of it is a sense of, well, my future must be here. Why would I need it? I'm not that curious anymore about the world, and I think that's very dangerous. And so, I don't think governments can fix that problem. And I think we in the Academy have a really special opportunity and obligation to lead a wider sense of education, a bigger mission. It's not just about training novices, young people, and setting them out into the world. It's about taking elites and giving them an opportunity to broaden themselves and become more cosmopolitan and open-minded and aware of their own biases, and aware that, if I'm sitting in Japan and I have certain views of what Chinese are like, actually I know some Chinese people through this project and they're not at all like that, and vice versa. And also, next time I'm in a position to make policy, I can pick up the phone and call that person and perhaps, ratchet things down a little bit. So I think it is a very dangerous time, and I think those of us who work in the area have an enormous obligation right now to really focus on that.
Annelise Riles, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.